Our gospel lesson comes from John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with his disciples. And now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's little brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of crowd in the place, so they sat down about 5 people. And when Jesus was seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples left over, so that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up for the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. They filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." And when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew to the mountain by himself. When the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So every week, we talk about God moments. We talk about where God has been living and active in our lives in the past week. And sometimes we see God in things like sunrises and sunsets and all of the beautiful things of creation. And sometimes we recognize God's presence in modern day miracles, things that we do not expect, ways that things work out when we don't think that they can. See, miracles still happen. And sometimes, I'm going to say far too often, we don't attribute them to God. We explain them away. We talk about coincidence. So as most of you know, I was on vacation this last week, and for the start of vacation, the very first thing we had to do was go to Baltimore Washington Airport and pick Brian up from the airport when he flew in from New Orleans so that he could go on vacation with us. Now, I woke up on Friday morning, as many of you did, to the news of the problems with Microsoft and flights. And I knew that on Saturday, about midday in New Orleans, my husband was going to get on an airplane that was to bring him to Baltimore. And I also knew that we were leaving from Baltimore to start the drive down to North Carolina because Sunday we had the wedding rehearsal for a wedding that Brian was to officiate. And not only was he going to officiate said wedding, but he was also a groomsman. So it was really important that we make it to the wedding rehearsal. And so Friday morning, when I heard the news about the flights, I began to pray that somehow Ryan's flight would not be affected, that we would be able to pick him up and make it to North Carolina as we planned. And then I texted him to let him know to check his flight continually. And I threw my book of worship into my bag, just in case I had to make the drive down to North Carolina without him, because at least that way the wedding could continue. Brian flew Southwest. Somehow Southwest was not affected. I consider that our modern day miracle. His flight was delayed, but only by a few minutes. And we picked him up at 9:45 instead of 9:20. I was grateful. And then I looked into the back seat just moments after we picked Brian up at the airport, and I saw the look on Timmy's face. I have never seen such happiness and excitement on somebody's face in my entire life. He missed his daddy so much. And they were back together again. And I was even more convinced that this event that some might consider luck, that Brian was on Southwest instead of on an airline that was affected, that he made it on time when so many did not. So many would consider that luck. I know it was God. And then it continued. And Timmy said, Mama, God brought us here, right? And God brought Daddy here. And I said, yeah. He said, I'm pretty sure this trip's gonna go just fine. I love to watch his faith grow when he sees the little things as well as the big things. Our week continued. It was a bit of a whirlwind, and we did the wedding on Monday, and early Wednesday morning we left and began the drive back. But instead of stopping at home, we drove right to the Poconos, where I met my college friends in a house that that we rented just to spend a couple of days together. Well, this house was in the middle of the woods. And over and over and over again, Timmy would come up to me and point out the windows excitedly as he saw deer, many, many deer. And so we took a walk and we looked at the deer and we saw a family, a buck, a doe, and a fawn. We watched as those deer, apparently used to people, got incredibly close to us. And we tried to explain to Timmy that it was important that he stay back. Because we realized at one point that the buck had walked right in the midst of us. And that inadvertently we had been surrounded. And we were afraid that as soon as he realized that he was surrounded, he might become afraid and try to attack. And so we all just quietly took a few steps back. We pulled all of the kids behind us, and we continued on our walk. God is everywhere, in the midst of people, in the midst of family, in the midst of friends, even in the midst of those deer and nature. So in our scripture today, we're full of Jesus' miracles. We get to talk about the miracle of the loaves and fish. Now this is a miracle that I am sure that you have learned about from the time that you were children. How all of these people came to hear Jesus speak, and somehow the only one who had managed to pack a lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fish, was a little boy. Everyone else went on this journey to follow Jesus, and they had no idea that they were going to be gone a long time. And so they didn't pack a lunch. And this was not like things are today. And Jesus could not just send everybody out to McDonald's. And so his disciples came to him and said, "What are we going to do? How are we going to feed all of these people?" Now, Jesus already knew the answer. But he asked Philip about getting food, and Philip responded about how much money it would take to buy food to feed every one of these people. Now, if I were to ask you, how many people were there? How many of you would respond immediately? 5,000. Some of you are nodding. 5,000, right? Wrong. There were many more than 5,000 people. Let me explain why. In that time, when they counted the 5,000, they only counted the men. They didn't count the women and the children. And so I promise you there were well more than 5,000 people. There may have been 10,000 or even more than that. Even the boy who brought the loaves and fish was not counted among the people present that day. And so we talk about the feeding of the 5,000 when really it was the feeding of way more than 5,000 people. But the disciples brought the loaves and fish to Jesus, and he blessed them. And they started coming up and delivering them to the people. And after everyone, all of the well over 5,000 people had their fill, there were still 12 basketfuls of food left over. 12 basketfuls from 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. This is probably the food that the boy had in one basket that he carried along on his journey. And there were 12 basketfuls left over. And so when the people saw what Jesus had done, they began to say, this really must be the prophet that has come into the world. This really must be him. And so here's the thing. When people see someone they think is the prophet coming into the world, they get excited. And because they get excited, they start to think in human terms about what should be done so they can make sure this prophet gets honored exactly the way that he should be honored. And so Jesus was quickly thinking when he realized that the people were about to come and take him by force to make him their king. Because he was, after all, the prophet. And they wanted to give him the highest position of respect. And they wanted him to be able to make all of the decisions about what was going to happen, because clearly he was amazing and could do all kinds of miracles, right? So they had this great plan that Jesus could be their king. And Jesus knew he wasn't talking about it. And so he disappeared. He withdrew to the mountain by himself. He did not gather his disciples together to talk about the situation. He left. And there were the disciples with all of the people and the 12 basketfuls of food. And Jesus was gone. And there were all of those people, 5,000 men, plus the women and children, trying to figure out where Jesus had gone. Because after all, they had found and just lost their king. So they eventually went home, and when evening came, the disciples went down to the sea, got in a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. They knew that he would. They knew that Jesus would find them. They, after all, were unable to find Jesus because he had disappeared. And it says the sea became rough. The strong wind was blowing. They rowed about 3 or 4 miles. Now that's a long way to row, isn't it? A long way after dark on a lake not lit up by lights. They could not really see that far in front of them. And still they rode 3 to 4 miles. And that's when they saw Jesus walking on the water and coming near the boat. Remember, there was a storm going on. The sea was rough. The wind was blowing. Jesus was walking on water. So how did they react? These were the disciples who had been part of miracles that they never expected to be part of. These are the disciples who helped to feed all of these people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. These are the disciples who collected the 12 basketfuls of bread and fish left over. And yet they were terrified. This was never something that they expected. Jesus walking on the water when it was stormy and dark. They didn't know immediately who it was. They only knew that it was a person walking on the water. They were probably exhausted. They had a very, very long day, and they just rode 3 to 4 miles in the dark. But he said, "It is I, don't be afraid." So they wanted to take him into the boat, but immediately the boat reached the land where they were going. So he never did climb into the boat. He walked on the water. And for the second time in one day, he showed his disciples who Jesus was. That Jesus was more than just a person to follow. That Jesus was more than just a prophet. That Jesus was Lord. Now, the disciples, unfortunately, did not spend the rest of their time following Jesus, not afraid at all. Because they were human beings. And things made them worry. Things made them afraid. They recognized that even though they followed Jesus, bad things could still happen. And so now, friends, we find ourselves in that same place the disciples were in, right? We've read about these miracles. Maybe, hopefully, we've seen all kinds of miracles on our own, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't still get afraid. We work to do all kinds of things. We work to make sure that maybe the world can be a better place. Jack told his story this morning about why he is involved in faith. That wasn't a decision that you had to make, but it was a brave one to make. To be able to work toward a better future. I hope that you are able to see the difference that you are making in the lives of so many people. Because instead of hiding in your grief, you made a decision to get involved. And I hope that makes you stand a little taller. Because it should. But friends, it isn't only Jack's story that's a story of survival. All of you have stories of survival as well. Times when things were hard and you stood up and you said, I am going to do the best that I can to make sure that I get through this with my head held high. And you've taken steps that you were not sure that you were able to take. And you did well. And do you know why? Because you serve Jesus. And Jesus helps us even when things are hard. The Bible never promises us that life will always be easy. The Bible never promises us that we won't go through hard times. But do you know what we are promised? That we're not going to go through them alone. And friends, that is why you are able to stand and say, I am where I am today. Because Jesus has helped me through. So my prayer for you is that you continue to recognize all of the myriad of ways that Jesus has helped you through. That you continue to look at them as God moments. That you continue to see that you do indeed have the strength that you need to get through no matter what comes. Because we do not walk alone. We walk with God. Ginger, can you go stop the recording, please?
Oh my God.